having a full platform or attempts at answers. I would be shy of doing that. Let's begin with the very topic and the abstract itself. On a viable European Union, some considerations. So the question is not how the European Union could be made better, could improve, etc. The frame of the question, the framework, concerns its viability. The realism that should things simply go on autopilot, this does not guarantee an ad infinitum continuation of the Union, but perhaps existential threats to it. So the question is, what would one have to do? What would the European Union have to do in order to combat those threats and in order to secure, to guarantee its viability? And as I've written in the abstract, a static EU would by definition be an inauspicious EU, and not that promising EU. And as we just described, that the European project has a future as a certainty is not a self-evident given. This relies upon the decisions that would guarantee it, or alternatively, upon the inactivity that could sentence it to rather dim prospects, one is afraid. Because we faced some crises in the future, but let us wait to see what happens in the post-COVID era, which is quite a frightening perspective to ponder. So, in my opinion, there are four central topics one would have to take into consideration in the desire to turn the European work in progress into a viable and future-oriented reality in the face of continuous and ever-growing challenges. And as far as the pandemic is concerned, this ever-growing challenges part, one can be acutely aware of what that means. So, the first aspect I would like to address is the question of real union in democratic diversity, which also entails abandoning a certain "our against your losses" mentality. First of all, this would have to do with the actual separation of European powers. Now we have in place, as a European Union, all the institutions that remind one of a state, a central bank, an executive branch, parliament, etc., etc. Yet some pieces of the puzzle seem to be missing. For example, the European Parliament is not a proper parliament in the sense of being able to propose and vote for laws, not simply to vote for laws that come from the executive, etc. So these are glitches in the structure of the European Union, the European project, that have to be addressed sooner rather than later. And they have to be addressed on their own merit, rather than necessarily as part of a project of further federalization, etc. The question is not which ideology will drive this development. The question is that this is a development that is a sine qua non for viability of a democratic superstate institution. So it would have to be addressed irrespective of however one dreams of the future of Europe in particular. A second question, which is acutely timely due to the pandemic, is debt mutualization. Now, some people hear debt mutualization and immediately have a defensive stance in the sense of, I'm frugal, you lead a celebratory lifestyle, why should I pay for you? No, you don't. But if you want a union, that's how unions take place. And examples include the Bundesrepublik, the Federal Republic of Germany, and of course, the United States of America. If the land of Berlin has bankruptcy problems, or if California has bankruptcy problems, it's not their own problem precisely because there is a union. And without this clause, there is no union, etc. So we faced this challenge for starters during the last decade, but now with the pandemic, this has become more acute. And frankly, we have no idea what the future holds for us. We didn't expect the pandemic to come. It wasn't in our grand plans for 2060 and decades to come, plans which we indulge in illustrating, etc., while reality may hit hard in unforeseeable with unforeseeable developments and circumstances. So this is an aspect, demutualization, that comes, that forms a natural part of unions, such as the one the European Union strives to be. Yet it's not part of the European Union currently, and there was an explicit resistance to this being the case, even during COVID. And why is the COVID part interesting? Because during the financial crisis, the mega financial crisis of the last decade, there has been a certain narrative of financially correct Northerners and not so financially apt Southerners. It's not one of the brightest pages of our union's history that there was a term for that, PIGS. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, etc. So during the financial crisis of the last decade, there was ground for such a narrative to develop. You know, some people did it worse than others, and well, they'll have to face their own reality. That was the narrative. But in the COVID era, this is simply not possible because demonstrably, this is an external cause which inflicts us all. So the question is not whose fault is it? By definition, it's nobody's fault. The question is how will we solve the problem so that there is a European Union not 2 years from now, not 4 years from now, but on a more long-term basis. The problem with long-term basis is that these are not electoral cycles bases. So politicians more often than not think in 4 years terms and 5 years terms rather than decades of future developments. Now, a third aspect here would be transparency and full visibility of decision-making processes. An example of this would be to live stream meetings such as the European Council, the ECOFIN, and the Eurogroup, because we noticed 5 years ago something which most Europeans did not know, that there are not even minutes of the Eurogroup, in spite of the fact that the responsibility and power invested in that unofficial, practically, committee, the Eurogroup, is immense, vast, and it has an effect on the lives of millions. Many people will say, live streaming those councils, those committees, how would that be possible? Well, currently, it's quite possible in the Bundestag, in the European Parliament, in the Hellenic Parliament, in the House of Commons, etc. So it's quite interesting, if not amusing, that we find it unthinkable that actual decision-making bodies, such as the Eurogroup, the ECOFIN, the European Council, must by definition be clandestine and take place in a cloak and dagger manner, rather than them being open as, one might say, equally important events are. Again, parliaments. That would not be asking for more than what already happens in that case. In spite of that fact, I would like to stress, to underscore how exotic this proposal sounds to some. And I would very much like to know, the argument why this is so exotic. There is a very dark potential argument here. The dark potential argument is that no, these particular meetings cannot be live streamed precisely because they are the primary decision-making processes. While, for example, the European Parliament, and God forbid that someone would use the argument, national parliaments are not. This is problematic on two different levels. The first level is obviously that it projects a certain desideratum of the important meetings not being live streamed. So it is an argument for a lack of transparency, and this would be very problematic. And the second dark side of such a potential counter-argument is the role it reserves for the European parliaments and national parliaments. Oh, these are not that important, so they can be live streamed. There is no risk in that. That's quite a horrid potential argument, which I hope we would all like to avoid. Now, all this circumscribes a certain attempt to avoid and now against your losses mentality, which entails having all the perks of a union without the price attached to them. Because, for example, there was a certain quite leftist saying during the last decades that the surpluses of the North are the deficits of the South. Unfortunately, there is some truth in that, in the sense that exports can take place on the scale that they took place within the European Union, precisely because, due to the common currency of the Eurozone, purchasing those products is now possible if one takes a certain loan, etc., etc. So, in any case, it's easier to purchase products which would not be exported to such a scale without the euro. So there is a certain truth to that. And this is, in my opinion, a powerful argument for debt mutualization. And again, this is not a question of improving the state of the union, but of viability. And I would like to stress that to the utmost degree, it's certainly not a question of solidarity. Solidarity, in my opinion, is a very problematic word in its weaponized use, particularly during the last decade. Solidarity as a word evokes images of not having to do something due to concerns of viability, but being magnanimous enough to help and love due to charitable sentiments. This is not the framework of the question here, I'm afraid. It's not a question of being charitable, open-hearted, magnanimous, etc. It is, again, a question of viability of a common project. And always there is an alternative to viability, non-viability. And there would be people desiring that openly, the Eurosceptics, and people implicitly desiring that, which would be the people who would oppose the measures that need to be taken in order for viability to be possible. I mentioned the Euroscepticism. This is also, I think, a topic of concern because we witness, well, apart from certain more loony aspects of Euroscepticism, etc., we witness a certain discontent and dissent. This discontent and dissent, more often than not, employs precisely arguments of a lack of transparency, of a lack of fully democratic processes, etc. This discontent and dissent should be addressed precisely by guaranteeing the transparency and democratic nature of activities and decision-making, rather than by explaining them away by the use of categories such as populism, which engender an us versus them binary. This is of cardinal importance. You have a huge population, the population of the European Union, or in a more restricted manner, the Eurozone, when we are discussing about matters concerning the Eurozone in particular. This is a huge population. We witness a dissent that is on the rise and discontent. We see that in European Parliament elections. We see that in national elections, etc. And it would be the definition of a lack of judgment, in my opinion, to respond to that, not by taking a good look at the very causes of that dissent and try to remedy those, but to point fingers in order to engender binaries. A binary of good, rational, Europeanist citizen versus evil populists who transform into beasts at night. This is something that we know from very basic political science and political history, because rulers who take into account only those that agree with them and glorify them usually have a rather short political life expectancy. Short in the case of something like the European Union does not mean a couple of years. It means it has a longer time span. But again, the question is one of viability. And the frame of what I'm trying to propose is precisely the concern and care for the project to be viable. It's important to repeat that from time to time in order to have the borders of the discussion visible and clear. We saw these challenges in 2010 onwards, in the crisis to come, and now in the COVID challenge. Again, now what has been charged as populism is taking another form, the form of an individual freedom versus security dilemma. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, this is a serious dilemma. This is a serious political discussion, which I'm afraid is not taking place within Europe, both at a pan-European level and at a national level, with the sternness it requires. Yes, the question of the balance between European freedom versus security, and in this case, security of health, being healthy, not dying, having basic biological security, is too important to be seen as a given, as a solved question, etc. Of course, the balance will tip to the side of mere biological existence at this very point, which we are to safeguard. But this should take place as part of a discussion and not being announced top down and then charging those who are not content with how the discussion has taken place. One must exhaust, I think, one must, as it were, exhaust the discussion so that precisely what one puts forward is convincing. Because what we are currently seeing, and very interestingly and bizarrely, particularly in Germany, is the extent to which this discontent is on the rise. Many people would like to be convinced were they to hear arguments which addresses their concerns. And it seems that this has not taken place to the extent that this would guarantee the required consensus, or so it seems. Now, there are other issues as well, structural issues. For example, have the central banks done what they could during the pandemic? One could say that yes, they have. However, there are institutional constraints in their action that has undermined the effectiveness of the initiatives. So when, for example, the European Central Bank would engender billions out of thin air, as she must do, she cannot but, due to its very bylaws, due to its very regulations, lend those billions to big banks practically for free, for example, to Deutsche Bank. Now, these huge banks, on their turn, will not give a loan out of this freshly generated money to small and medium enterprises, because the banks would be afraid that they would not get their money back. So they would give these huge amounts of freshly generated euros to huge corporations like Apple or Volkswagen, etc. However, these corporations have already immense amounts of capital, and they will not invest due to a certain very rational fear that the demand for their products will be low during times such as the pandemic. So they take the loans out of those huge banks, out of those freshly generated euros by the European Central Bank, and they use them to buy their own shares, thereby heightening their prices in stock markets and the bonuses of the directors, etc., their executives. What is the problem with this? The problem is that the money that the European Central Bank engenders is not going back into actual investment, that is not serving the very purpose this money was generated, but is doing a vicious circle of a very different nature within big corporations. So you have a European Central Bank which can do what it must do, engender billions of euros in times of crisis, such as our current horrid predicament. But the aim and objective of this begetting of money, by definition, due to the restrictions of the European Central Bank cannot be fulfilled. This is a structural problem which I think we'll all agree must be solved prior to the next crisis, prior to the eruption of the very next crisis, which is the crisis we know, the fiscal crisis after the health aspect of the pandemic, after we're all happily vaccinated, and B, the crisis that we don't know. Because as Donald Rumsfeld famously said, there are four categories: things we know, things we don't know, things we know, we don't know, and things we don't know, we don't know. Now, a third aspect of this whole discussion, in my opinion, would be decentralization. This is an aspect that is not usually discussed in the context of discussions concerning the European Union's viability and future. We saw a very slight tendency towards decentralization. I mean now decentralization within the member states, not decentralization on a European, not decentralization of power. This is the question of decentralization of power, a European-wide decentralization of power, concerns the aspects I try to address prior to this point. But here I'm referring to decentralization within member states. We saw a slight tendency towards that in the pandemic, yet this was slightly on the nostalgic side. On nostalgic terms of the quiet life, of the realism of seeing how the pandemic and the lockdowns hit the mega cities in particular, the huge capitals and cities, and how life elsewhere would be more humane, etc. However, the aspect that I would like to address does not concern this part of the question, the COVID-related one, the nostalgic one, the neo-agrarian one, etc. It concerns a more political and democratic question. Now we have huge cities, practically mega cities like London, London is not part of a state that's currently the European Union, but you can get the point. Paris, etc. Germany does not have this problem to such an extent with a capital that only has less than 4 million inhabitants. It does not have mega cities of horrid proportions, but it is a European problem. For example, Greece, in my native Greece, Athens, the capital, has half of the country's population. There's another city, Thessaloniki, with 1 million population, and then there is chaos. The population size of other cities is significantly lower. We witness practically a very political difference between those cities, particularly big cities and, God forbid, mega cities, such as Paris, and the provinces. Let us take Brexit as an example. If one looks at the map of Brexit, it's very obvious that people in big cities voted very differently than people in provinces, etc. Well, one can explain that away by a self-glorifying argument, which would be very elitist, like, people in big cities are more educated, so they make the right political decisions, which they just so happen to be the political decisions I, the speaker, agree with. But this would not be the correct route, in my opinion. We see that we have practically a network of big cities that have a very homogeneous mindset, politically so as well. And then we have provinces in the countries, in the member states themselves, that are so detached from the capitals or big cities, because these two do not necessarily and always coincide, that they practically belong to different worlds. If one takes a good look at this perspective, one immediately notices that this is also an often overlooked question of viability. Because if you end up within Europe with capitals and big cities being of one political persuasion, and their very provinces within member states being of a very different political persuasion, then you have a binary and disjunction of a very different, subtle, silent, and dangerous kind. This could form dissent in the European Union, although on a much more long-term basis, much more forcefully and radically than other things, or things we consider today to be big question. This is a chasm, an abysmal chasm, which I think requires addressing it via decentralization. Apart from that, there's also a question of the very viability of those huge cities itself. And we witnessed that due to the pandemic, when the very fact that the life of those cities came to a certain halt exposed the unnatural conduct of those cities. The very moment they are revealed, disclosed in their true nature, apart from the buzzing life of their everyday conduct, they stop seeming like human abodes anymore. This turns us to our fourth pillar, ecological sustainability as a top priority, with a pronounced disdain from the industrial grudges that this would entail. In order to address this, the discussion must start with the following question. Is climate change an existential threat? If one accepts that climate change is indeed an existential threat, and one that will visit us much sooner than perhaps some expect, then this frames the question in a very radical manner. And so solutions that are not really solutions, but seem more like political communication at times, political communication stints, would simply not cut it, would not do the job they're required to do. I'm very much afraid that the current initiatives of the Union do not truly and adequately cover this burning question, burning, no pun intended, due to global warming, because it seems that this European New Deal is a product and a result of a certain tug of war between differing interests, a certain bras de fer, which tries to demonstrate that one is indeed taking initiatives without them being adequate. Now, this, in my opinion, has to be replaced by an actual European Green New Deal, an actual one, not a make-believe one, which would take note of the urgency of the situation and address it as the priority it is. This, by definition, cannot only be top-down. Citizens and their communities must be empowered to make the decisions that shape their future. However, another trick in order not to address this question properly is turning it into a question of the responsibility of the individual. Of course, I'm recycling, of course, I'm dividing my garbage into the ones that can be recycled and the ones that cannot. But salvation, if I'm to put it in religious terms, from climate change will not come because I, as Sotiris, divide my garbage. So this is the forbidden fruit, as it were, of the whole narrative, to turn it into an individual awareness, individual responsibility thing. No, we have here to do with a question of a struggle against huge interests that cannot be simply convinced with arguments, however good they might be, to turn, well, practically the Union into an ecologically sustainable one, including countries, but the whole spectrum of the Union as an entity as well. Because the science is clear, if we must limit the global temperature rise to the very least 1.5 degrees and reverse the collapse of our ecosystems, or we will be very literally doomed. Now, that Green New Deal would call on public institutions to drive the economic and ecological transformation, precisely because it's not a question of individual responsibility. The burden of our transition should not fall on the shoulders of families and individuals, not least because simply this is not possible. This will not deliver the result we would like it to believe. Now, this is not something that costs. Rather than that, an actual European Green New Deal would also engender positions, engender jobs and a new kind of financial strategy that would also address other issues of concerns like unemployment, etc. And not only jobs in general, but decent jobs, high quality jobs, while also empowering communities. A very last aspect I would like to very briefly address is the question of the re-examination of Europe's historical, cultural, and religious versus secular self-understanding. We often take for granted what Europe is, or we often, and this is also another question, we often mix up the European Union with Europe. Europe and the European Union are two different things by definition. The first is a geographic and historical entity, Europe. The European Union is a union of states, particular states, and not other states, like Switzerland, like Norway, and this is news, like the UK. So there is a certain European narcissism in this confluence of the European Union and Europe. We must be more self-conscious, I think, of the fact that it's the European Union we're discussing about rather than Europe as a vague entity. We often project into this entity, which we confuse with the European Union, Europe, a self-evident given of what it means historically, culturally, etc., etc. I'm afraid, however, that this is not the case. Let us take a different category as an example in order to, stray away from the question of Europe itself and see more clearly the categories behind it. Let us see the content projected from time to time upon the geographic entity, the West. By the way, there's a whole field, critical geopolitics, which precisely questions these political contents we ascribe to geographical entities, etc. The West is not one thing, it varies widely. There was a time where there was even a minimal West, which was only the British Isles, and they would speak about the wargs at Calais, etc. Then it was medieval Western Europe, as it were. Then it was the Euro-Atlantic axis. Then there is a more globalized West, practically entailing everything save Antarctica, etc. So there is no one thing that is the West. The same goes for Europe. Let me give a very slight example. Okay, now we have a certain grudge with Russia due to political concerns of authoritarianism, concerns of the figure of its head of state in particular, etc. But apart from that, it's interesting that we ponder the inclusion of countries such as Turkey, for example, within the European Union. But it's a given that Russia would never be part of that, even though we can very easily imagine European culture without, for example, Turkey. But it's impossible to really imagine in a viable way European culture with its literature, history, etc., and civilizational influence, as it were, without parts of Russian inheritance, such as Dostoevsky. There is no Europe without Dostoevsky, obviously. So we see now that we project certain givens into a notion, which are not really there. What I tried to do in my argument was not to argue against the inclusion of Turkey and for the inclusion of Russia, but to show how we take for granted certain things which are not to be taken for granted. Now, recently, particularly in relation with the question of immigration, etc., we started speaking in the European Union about a European way of life, our way of life. It's a bit opaque what precisely this means. Whereas the genealogy of the term is not opaque at all. This is a Cold War term. This is a Cold War term which the free world, the Western world, etc., used against the Soviet Union, our way of life. Now we copy and paste this Cold War notion into the European paradigm. And we say, yes, there is a European way of life. Now, were we to pinpoint what this actually is, we would have difficulty finding answers that are not self-glorifying or do not have elements of wishful thinking. because we would say, let me put it very bluntly, we would say, for example, it's a continent of democracy, liberty, institutions, and human rights. One cannot so easily exclaim that triumphantly in the case of Hungary, though, right now. So the self-evident given of the government of Hungary, I mean, not the Hungarian people, of course, the self-evident given that we are a union, if not even a continent, of certain values, such as democracy, which we have yet others don't have, human rights, which we respect yet others do not respect, certain liberalism, which describes us yet not others, etc. This is a slippery slope which perhaps we would like to avoid. The problem is that politicians often do lack the historical depth to struggle with these questions accurately, etc. So they come up with phrases which are self-undermining precisely because they entail uses of words and notions which can backfire. To my mind, this European way of life, which, by the way, was used also recently, particularly in the case of the Republican values, as it were, in France, in an initiative that presented itself as safeguarding the freedom of speech, but it was very thinly, the fact that it was against Muslims in particular was very thinly veiled. And we saw that in discourses that emerged that actually said, that there's a question with the Muslim religion and our institutions, our way of life, etc. To my mind, this is a very dangerous, slippery slope. And not only that, but it argues on the basis of a certain conflicting narrative. Because on the one hand, you have the narrative that our concern is secularism, our concern is a free community where all religions coexist, but there is no preponderance of a certain religion. But you also have a hidden tendency, as it were, which takes on an identitarian version of Christianity, and while not speaking it clearly and loudly, implies that this is a Christian continent and a Christian union, even though this Christianity is now culturally appropriated into secularism itself. And so some people would not belong here and cannot be integrated here. The very change from an era where we would speak of multiculturalism, etc., to this current era where the narrative has changed so radically and so wildly, even though one has at times to read between the lines, is staggering. And this has to be addressed again in order for viability to be possible. There's also the question, but I will not go into that because I have blabbered on, of historical depth. We saw during the last decade a question of North versus South, as in Protestant versus Catholic, perhaps. And we see in other terms a question of West versus East, Catholic and then Protestants versus Orthodox, like Greece, for example. This need not have a religious purchase as such, but it can have a cultural, a secularized cultural, civilizational, historical purchase as well. Because when, for example, the European Union will create a museum for its history, and the commencement of its historical legacy is Charlemagne, this is an exclusively, in medieval terms, Western European self-understanding of Europe, which seems not to have place, or ample place at the very least, for those both that predate that understanding and do not form part of it. Now, if you want to include, for example, Greece or other countries as well that are currently in the Union, or countries that may be in the Union very soon, and you say we are the political offsprings of Charlemagne, then one would be lost in discussion. In translation, one would be lost in translation. Thank you very much. I hope I have not taken immense part of your time. And I remain in the hope of a fruitful discussion with many thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very